A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Verily, all praise is due to Allah. We praise Him, we seek His aid, and we ask for His forgiveness. We seek refuge in Allah from the evils of our own selves and from the evils of our own actions. And whomsoever Allah guides, none can misguide. And whomsoever Allah leaves astray, none can guide back to the correct path. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We testify there is no deity worthy of our worship except for Allah, who is alone with no partnership, that never has and never will be another. And we bear witness that Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, is the last and the final prophet of Allah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Brothers and sisters, friends and family members, especially all who are joining in to our local Zoom meeting. Inshallah, we invite all others to join us as well. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Thank you for joining for our Monday discussion, where we will be continuing on the ethics of disagreement in Islam, written by Taha, Jabir, Alalwan. With that, we're going to be starting in chapter 6 today, going I'm sorry, I said chapter 6. I meant to say, I didn't mean chapter 6 here. I was looking ahead a little bit, inshallah, for juristic perspectives. So we finally got past the time of the companions and their generation, the following generation, the Tabi'un, and now we're getting into some of their juristic perspectives and schools of jurisprudence, also known as madhabs. And I mentioned before a couple of times regarding some of this intertwines into one of the previous books that we had reviewed previously. I'd say relatively I'd say it's almost been 2 years now, regarding the history or the backgrounds regarding the madhabs, written by Dr. Bilal Phillips. That really goes intensely into the details, the historical perspectives, the scholars and whatnot. But today we're going to be getting into some minor parts, so you can kind of see where they're coming from and kind of understand the big picture, as opposed to getting into the nitty-gritty details. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Bismillah. So after the age of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ and their eminent successors in the period from the end of the 1st century after the Hijrah to the middle of the 3rd century, there appeared some 13 schools of thought, or madhabs, or mahibib, or singular madhab in Islamic jurisprudence. And they all identified with Ahl al-Sunnah, or upholders of the Sunnah school, which was and still is the prominent school in the Muslim world today. And unfortunately, only the works of 8 or 9 of the leading scholars, or the A'imah, of these schools have been fully or partially recorded. From these recorded works in their various forms, the juristic principles, or the usul, and methodologies of the different schools have become known. And the leading scholars were as follow, and I'm going to try not to butcher them, is Abu Sa'id al-Hasan ibn Yasar al-Basri. The second is Abu Hanifa al-Nu'man ibn Thabit ibn Zuti. Third is al-Awza'i Abu Amru Abd al-Rahman ibn Amru ibn Muhammad. Fourth is Sufyan ibn Sa'id ibn Masruq al-Thawri. Fifth is al-Layth ibn Sa'd. Sixth is Malik ibn Anas al-Ashbahi. Seventh is Sufyan ibn Uyayna. Eighth is Muhammad ibn Idras al-Shafi'i. And ninth is Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Hanbal. And if you recognize some of the names inside of this, that would probably be because of the major madhabs that we know and many of us follow today. And there are other A'imah, such as Dawood ibn Ali al-Ashbahani al-Baghdadi, better known as al-Zahiri, because of his instance on sticking to the manifest or zahir, or literal meaning of expression in the Quran and the Sunnah, or Ishaq ibn Zahrahawai and Abu Thar ibn Ibrahim ibn Khalid al-Kalbi. And there are others whose schools of jurisprudence did not spread, or whose followers were not many, or who, in fact, were considered to be followers of the schools of the world of more well-known scholars. However, the Aimah, whose schools have lasted to this day, who have followers throughout the Muslim world, and whose principles and jurisprudence are still employed in assessing issues and in making legal judgments, are mainly four. Today, we have Abu Hanifa, Malik al-Shafi, and Ahmed ibn Muhammad ibn Hanbal. So the methodologies of the famous scholars, or A'imah, the three leading scholars, Malik, al-Shafi, and Ibn Hanbal, are considered as jurists of hadith and the established precedents of the companions of the Prophet. So their jurisprudence was that of the people of Medina, whose knowledge they propagated. So Imam Abu Hanifa, however, was the inheritor of the jurisprudence of upholders of independent reasoning. We had gone over last week, al-Ra'i, becoming the foremost advocate of the school of his age. And the difference which existed between the school of Sayyid ibn al-Musayyib, whose teachings were based on the jurisprudence and established precedents of the companions of the Prophet, and which enjoyed the support of the Malikiyah, the Shafi'i, and the Hanbila, and the schools of Ibrahim al-Nakhai, which relies on independent reasoning in the absence of established precedent or ijma. This difference was naturally passed on to whoever adopted the methodology of either school. So we see a pattern here. But the intensity with which this difference was maintained was reduced considerably, particularly after the Khalifa went to the Banu Abbas, or the Abbasiyun, in the middle of the 2nd century. So we have, I'm drawing a blank on the first, after the Rashidun Khalifa, then the Uthmayyids, and then we have the Abbasiyun, which is the next empire that came to be the flag bearers of Islam afterwards. So following the shift of power, the Abbasiyun transferred some of the eminent scholars from the Hijaz to Iraq in order to spread the Sunnah from among the people there. As we had mentioned from last week, there was some difficulties in retaining whether or not there was truthful hadith or references inside of that area. And some of these scholars were Rabi'a ibn Abi Abd al-Rahman, Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Iraqi, Hisham ibn Urwa, and Muhammad ibn Ashaq. And at the same time, some of the Iraqi scholars went to Medina and studied with scholars there. And Yusuf, Yaqub ibn Ibrahim, and Muhammad ibn al-Hassan studied with Malik, and all of this resulted in a mutual exchange of ideas between Iraq and the Hijaz. So nonetheless, we find that these three scholars, Malik, al-Shafi'i, and Ibn Hanbal, were quite similar in their methodology, even though they differed in some approaches in using deduction. But the methodology of Imam Abu Hanifa remained quite distant. And if we can reference from the previous week too, the reason why there's this difference is because of their references regarding their hadith. If there is no question or a good chain or isnad of authority to be able to distinct what is correct or incorrect, then there would not be as much emphasis on the validity of things as what Imam Abu Hanifa had to go through inside of the Iraqi area, which is why they put so much emphasis on that, because even if they had hadith, it wasn't always truthful or narrated correctly or well. But the methodology of Imam Abu Hanifa is summarized in such. So the principles of Abu Hanifa's methodology are summarized in his own statement, so we can get his own perspective. So first, I resort to the book of Allah to find evidence if I am faced with an issue. If I do not find any reference therein, I report to the Sunnah of the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and authentic precedents from him which have been handed down by trustworthy persons. If I do not find anything in the book of Allah or in the sunnah of his messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I resort to the statements of his companions, drawing freely upon these as I wish. I do not go beyond this to the statement of others. If the line of inquiry descends to the rank of Ibrahim al-Shabi or Ibn Musayyib, then I'm entitled to endeavor to use my ijtihad in the same way as which they had done. And there are cardinal principles to Abu Hanifa's madhab. There are, however, some subsidiary or secondary principles which appear to give rise to differences with the other scholars in this madhab. So as an example, the general or am expression is as categorical or definitive, qata'i, in its implication as the particular, the khas, and the practice of a companion which is at variance with the general practice is taken only as a specific evidence for his practice. The abundance of narrators does not improve the validity or weightiness of the evidence. There's no consideration that should be given to a general proposition. There's no consideration should be given to a general proposition which is qualified by way of introducing a condition, a shart, or a qualification, a sifa. No acceptance is given to a tradition transmitted by a single person which could harm public welfare. An obligatory command must be acted upon unless there is a constraint which prevents it. If the conduct of a competent narrator is at variance with what he has narrated, do what he was seen to have practiced and not what he narrated. Priority should be given to a clear-cut analogy over the report of a single person, khabar al-wahid, which is in contradiction to it, and juristic preference al-istihsan should be adopted and the analogy abandoned when there appears the need to do so, or istihsan is the preference given to one rule over another because of its perceived superiority. So Abu Hanifa is reported to have said, "We know that this is an opinion and it is the best that we were able to produce. However, whoever comes with a better opinion, we will accept it." And going back to the terms, or the point of this entire book is to reference and show that even these great scholars, the people who even now today are referenced and use as the predecessors to a pathway of knowledge to millions of people, still had this premise that they are able to step down from their position, from the knowledge which they have, if of course the better knowledge comes, because that is the point of us gaining that sort of knowledge, so that we can come across to the most accurate according to our discoveries. Next, it gets into the methodology of Ibn Malik, so we can kind of compare and contrast between the two. So Malik adopted a different approach, of course, and of course Malik was more relative to the Hijaz or Egypt or even Syria and Damascus, a sort of area before. Even today, a lot of it stretches into Maghrib, or a lot of it is in going into even the Levant area. But he is reported to have said, "How is it that whenever someone comes to us with an argument, we abandon what Jibril brought to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and argue with him?" We have already mentioned that Malik's methodology was that of the people of the Hijaz, upholders of the school of Sayyid ibn Musayyib, and the principles of Malik's school of thought may be summarized thus in order of priority. So this is what the Maliki school generally, their way of deduction or way of coming to the truth in priority is. First is the reliance on the unequivocal verbatim text of the Quran. Second is reliance on the clear or manifest meaning of when it is general. Next is validation of evidence from the Quran of a divergent meaning. So when there's multiple meanings or different understandings of meanings. Next is validation of a harmonious meaning. Fifth is a reliance on the Quran's warning or cautioning as effective reasoning for avoiding anything which is an abomination or is immoral, as in the Quranic verse, for verily it is an abomination or is immoral and impious. Surah 6, ayat 145. But then after these 5 principles regarding to the Quran, there are 10 others from the Sunnah in the order of priority. So first is consensus, and this is coming from consensus of different scholars. Ijma, qiyas, so relative logical deduction. The next, which is very particular to the Maliki school of thought, is the practice of the people of Medina, which goes back that, and the argument and evidence for this is that how could it be that the practices and acts of the people of Medina, who were the followers and the companions and the descendants of those who followed the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how is it that they were to follow anything different other than what he had followed, and they in themselves would have created this bubble of influence so that they wouldn't have gone outside of it. So when we cannot come with any sort of evidence for it, yet this culture would happen to have it, they would use this as a proof and evidence as to deriving what is correct. Next is istisan, which involves setting aside an established analogy in favor of an alternative ruling which serves the ideals of justice and public interest in a better way. The next is blocking the means to evil, or sad al-dahara'i, or next is considerations of public interest. Next is testimony by a companion if the chain of transmission is sound and he is an eminent companion. Next would be consideration of disputed matters where divergent evidence is strong. Next is presumption of continuity of that which is proven and the negation of that which had not existed, and istisab. And lastly, acceptance of some laws which existed before Islam. Alhamdulillah. And next we move to the methodology of Imam Shafi, which in reference Imam Shafi, if I recall correctly, or from my last reference to it, is the most followed madhab today. And it's also one of the, it's kind of one of the middlemen, middle of the two. Next around the same time around Imam Malik, whereas Hanbali is one of the later, he actually studied or had influence from Imam Shafi, if I recall correctly. But the principles of this school of thought of al-Shafi are contained in his book Al-Risala, which is considered to be the first and most comprehensive book on the principles of Islamic jurisprudence. And al-Shafi'i says in this book that the Quran and the Sunnah are the original sources of Islamic jurisprudence. If there's no clear evidence in these two, the judge may resort to qiyas from these two. If there is a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ whose chain of transmission is sound, no other sources shall be consulted. Ijma is more authoritative than the report of a hadith transmitted by a single person, and the interpretation of a hadith should be based on its clearly apparent meaning. If the hadith is open to various interpretations, preference should be given to the interpretation which is closest to the apparent meaning. If a number of ahadith pertaining to a special issue are equal in their import, preference should be given to the hadith whose isnad is sound. And in this respect, a hadith whose isnad, again, isnad, chain of narration, is interrupted or munqati, should not be consulted except by those reported by Ibn al-Musayyib. An analogy from a principle or asl which has already been deduced from a previous principle is not admissible. And there should be no question as to say why or how with regard to the original source. Questions as to why should only be addressed to a subsidiary source of law. And if analogical deduction from the original source proves to be sound, it should be accepted as such and as a basis for proof. And al-Shafi therefore considered the Quran and the Sunnah as equal in formulating legislation. No condition should be imposed on a hadith except its authenticity and correct chain of transmission, since it is in itself a primary source of law. And consequently, there should be no question as to why or how about a valid source of law. And al-Shafi would not impose any condition on a hadith which is well known, that is muhashur, when it pertains to matters of general necessity, as does Abu Hanifa. But unlike Malik, al-Shafi believes that hadith need not be in agreement with the practice of the people of Medina. However, he rejects hadith mursal, hadith transmitted by a successor without indicating the companions who reported it to him in general, but accepts a hadith mursal of Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib because in his case, he possessed continuous chains of transmitters. And Malik al-Thawri and his contemporaries, along with the Ahl al-Hadith, those specializing in adhering to the Hadith and the Sunnah, differed from al-Shafi in this regard and used such Hadith mursal to refute contrary arguments. And unlike the Malikiyah and the Hanafiya, al-Shafi rejected istisan as a source of Islamic law. In refutation of this principle, he wrote a book titled Ibtal al-Istisan, Invalidating Juristic Preference, in which he made his famous statement, "Whoever argues from juristic preference is making himself the lawmaker." He also rejected the formulation of laws on the principle of the public interest or masalaha al-musaleh, together with the proofs advanced to support this principle. He rejected the use of analogy that was not based on an effective cause or ilah that was established and clearly manifest in the Quran and the Sunnah. And he rejected proofs based on the practice of the people of Medina. And he was critical of the Hanafiya for their non-compliance with many of the Sunnah practices because the hadith on which they were based failed to meet some of the conditions. Conditions, for example, such as the popularity of the hadith. And finally, he did not confine himself to the hadith of the people of the Hijaz as Malik did. And these are salient and the most important principles of al-Shafi's school of thought, and the differences between them and those formulated by the schools of Malik and Abu Hanifa are quite obvious. And lastly, we get to Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. So the principles of the Hanbali school of thought are extremely close to those of the Shafi school, which would make sense because he studied under him. So these principles in order of priority are as such. First, so when an evidence is available in the text of the Quran and the Sunnah, he does not consult to any other source. If there is a hadith which is raised, marfu, to the level of authenticity, he does not give priority to any other source, such as the practice of the people of Medina, independent reasoning, analogy, a companion's saying, or consensus based on the lack of knowledge of the questions in dispute. But second, if no text is available on a question, Ibn Hanbal resorts to the juristic judgments of the companions. If he finds a companion saying which is not contested by other companions, he adheres to this saying and gives it priority over any other practice, opinion, or analogy. Third, if there is a difference of opinion among the companions over a particular issue, he chooses the opinion which is closest to the Quran and the Sunnah and does not go beyond this. And if it is not clear to him which opinion is closest to the Quran or the Sunnah, he would report the controversy in complete objectivity and abstain from making any decision. Fourth, he takes as an authority any hadith, whether mursal or da'if, weak, whose authenticity in either its chain or transmission or content is not absolutely beyond question, provided it does not clash with an established practice, a companion saying, or a consensus of opinion. You would give such a hadith priority over analogical deduction. And in his fifth, in his opinion, analogy should only be resorted to as a source of law when there is a necessity of passing judgment on an issue which cannot be settled by referring it to any of the previously mentioned sources and principle. And then lastly, 6, you would adopt the principle of Sad al-Dhahra'i, or blocking the means to wrongdoing, basically choosing what is the better of two things. And then lastly, we get to the methodology of Imam Dawood al-Zahiri. And it is perhaps appropriate to give a brief idea of the principles and sources of the Zahiri school of thought, in as much as it is one of the Islamic schools which still has some influence and a following among those who uphold the Sunnah. So there were serious controversies between this school and that of Abu Hanifa and later Malik, Ibn Hanbal, and al-Shafi. However, al-Zahiri recognized his great depth to al-Shafi. The salient feature of the Zahiri school is its adherence to outwardly manifest meaning from the text of the Quran and of the Sunnah. So priority is given to these meanings over any other considerations of alternative interpretation, of judgment, or public interest. And the followers of these schools do not practice analogy and contend that it is only applicable when there is an effective cause or ratio legis in a text that can be applied to another case, which, although not covered by the language, is covered by this cause or reason in the text. So this means that the existence of ratio legis is a prerequisite for applying analogy. And they prohibit the use of istisan and only draw upon the ijma arrive at the time of the companions. Unlike the Malikiya, the Hanafiya, and the Hanbaliya, they do not use any hadith laws previous to the Quran, and they do not allow anyone to apply independent reasoning on the basis of the Quranic verse. Surah 6, Ayat 38, nothing have we omitted from the book. And according to this, they argue that the laws are expressly stated in the original sources, and that to disregard this is to transgress the limits set by Allah. And they consider that the following ruling handed down by a given school or taqlid is prohibited to the common man as is to the scholar, and that every adult Muslim has the responsibility of striving to learn the correct ruling by himself. And it is true to say that many of the principles which are attributed to the leading jurists do not deviate from their actual statements and are not collaborated by authentic reports. And these baseless principles are then adhered to and defended against any criticism or opposing view. And all this gives rise to constant controversy and ultimately detracts attention from the Quran and the Sunnah. And this is one of the main causes of controversy, which the A'imah themselves never intended. And latter-day Muslims have drifted far away from the matters of high priority and have become engrossed in trivial matters, and this accounts for the low depths to which the Muslims have sunk to today. And with that, we come to the end of today's reading, and we will continue next week into the reasons for differences, chapter number 7. We hope to see you, and please join us for the Zoom meeting for the after the presentation discussion and interaction with one another. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward and bless all of you. Allahumma subhanaka wa bihamdi ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.